My name is Mary Booth. I'm the director and founder of the Partnership for Policy Integrity. It's a small nonprofit located in the United States. We work on forests, biomass energy, and climate. And we work both in the United States and in the European Union, and actually internationally elsewhere as well.
So I want to just briefly, before we get to talk about why is it a bad idea to use biomass for generated energy?
Well, we've seen a really big increase in use of biomass around the world, especially in the European Union. And biomass can be all kinds of things, plant material, but it's mostly wood. And burning wood for energy is typically incentivized as renewable energy alongside wind and solar, but it emits carbon just like fossil fuels does. And of course, it's treated as carbon neutral, but we know that trees don't grow back overnight. They're not going to instantly grow back and resequester the carbon that's being emitted when you burn trees. So this is contributing carbon to the atmosphere and helping warm the climate. And it's not carbon neutral, even though it's treated that way in policy.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but biomass was didn't thought of as like as a byproduct or waste product, right? So it was like the waste product of some kind of factory process. So you use the waste wood for burning energy, or you would use waste farming material for generating energy. But I guess what I understand that what the kind of industrial scale of producing biomass is, do you actually go down, you actually cut down forest for using the biomass?
That's right. Well, the biomass industry used to be relatively small and relatively self-contained. Mills, sawmills that had wood left over from lumber processing, paper mills, that kind of thing. They did indeed burn waste, sawdust, black liquor at paper mills. And as long as the industry was just burning waste, it still wasn't exactly carbon neutral, but it wasn't representing a direct threat to forests. What happened is that the renewable energy subsidies are so lucrative that the forest industry and the biomass industry saw a big opportunity to make money, and they've dramatically expanded the scope and the scale of biomass burning. And so now they are going out and they're harvesting trees specifically as biomass fuel. And we see this nowhere more than with the wood pellet industry, which is all over the world, but both in the EU and the United States and Canada, that are cutting down trees, turning them into pellets, and shipping them to Europe and even to Asia as a so-called carbon neutral renewable fuel as a substitute for coal. So this is a big problem because it's a direct threat to forests.
So biomass recently came under fierce criticism in Jeff Gibbs and Michael Moore's new film Planet of the Humans. Surely that's a good one. They're taking up the fight against biomass, aren't they? And finally someone is highlighting the issue.
That film is super problematic. They did get the biomass part right, but they got so much else wrong in that movie that I fear, sorry, I just hit my, I fear that they are doing a lot more harm than good with that movie. And actually, I was in a movie and helped as a science advisor on a movie about the biomass industry a couple of years ago, and it's called Burned, Are Trees the New Coal? And that movie actually is much more science-based, and it's a full documentary just on bioenergy. So I recommend that people go to the website, which is burnedthemovie.com, and they can watch that movie for free if they want to learn more about the biomass industry. And you don't have to watch the Jeff Gibbs movie at all.
We will definitely be sure to link to that great film in this interview. What was interesting about the film is that it had one of the interview people in there was Bill McKibben, who who came under fierce criticism in Mark Mordjeff's film for actually supporting biomass. And I believe that originally he did support a small-scale biomass project many years ago, but since then he's come out really vocal against it, hasn't he?
That's right. Bill has been a fantastic ally in the fight against large scale biomass, and it's true. He was a supporter of a small biomass plant at Middlebury College, and a lot of people were. I mean, the IPCC members were. But once they learned, and Bill in particular, once he learned about the carbon imbalance of burning wood quickly and trees not regrowing very quickly, and it's not just wastes and residues being burned, he became a very vocal critic of the biomass industry. And he's worked closely with my organization and many others to do fantastic work, publishing articles about this, raising awareness. And that happened several years ago, that he changed his mind about biomass, and he was, honest about it and just admitted, I was mistaken before, I've made a change. And so it's really honestly mystifying to me why that movie would target Bill in such a mean-spirited way. It was really wrong. It's a wrong thing to do.
Absolutely. I guess from your point of view is that you want to protect forests because, and you talk about carbon because you obviously understand that climate change is a huge problem that we need to deal with, and you'll then argue. I don't put word in your mouth, but I assume you'll argue that we shouldn't burn biomass. We should instead go invest lots more heavily in wind and solar. But obviously, Planet Humans argued that none of the clean energy technologies work.
Yeah, well, they're just wrong about that. They're just wrong about that. But and they're especially wrong on things like the efficiency of solar and how much, what the return on energy investment is. They're just way out of date. But no one is saying that renewable energy doesn't have an impact. And we know we do face issues with siting of windmills and solar farms and things. And we have to be careful about that. We have to be thoughtful about that. I think something that a lot of renewable energy people don't think about enough, we're all sort of siloed, is the question of land use. And the increasingly apparently important role of land, because what the IPCC says is that we have to not only reduce emissions but dramatically increase carbon uptake from the atmosphere. And what does that? Forests do that. And changing our farming practices so that soils sequester more carbon, just changing everything to store more carbon on the land. And this has got to be a priority in everything we do, and including, the renewable energy industry needs to be cognizant about land use and try and not, for instance, cut down forests to put in solar farms. That's not a great idea.
Absolutely not. And I guess from your point of view, obviously, yeah, trees are renewable, they grow, but once you cut down a tree and you burn it, you basically lose all that carbon spill over years. But whether if you were to use those trees as building material and protect them properly, that you're still storing that carbon, aren't you?
There is a role for harvested wood products. I think it's been overstated somewhat. If we look at the each country reports carbon inventory data to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and those data are publicly available. You can go in there and see how much of the carbon sequestration for each member state in the EU and the United States is represented by building products, like not just building products, but any wood product that's, converted into some long-lived wood product. And it is a piece of the pie, but it's not a huge piece of the pie. And people who are advocating that somehow if we only just start replacing everything that, like with concrete, that is currently built out of concrete and steel, that we could do a lot more things with wood, that we could store a lot more carbon that way. Those analyses are not that well founded. They rely on a lot of assumptions. And meanwhile, you're disturbing forests. Like if you increase logging, you're disturbing forests, and there's tremendous loss of carbon out of forests when you log them for any reason, even if you are capturing some of that carbon to be stored in long-lived wood products.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So what are the current status in the US? Obviously, I know there's also issue about one of the, I think it's actually the biggest power plant in the UK, Drax, who are now converted into a biomass burning facility, and partly part of the mix of why UK have given up coal, and they import their wood, their biomass pellets from the US as well. So how fast is the industry growing in the US, and also where are we as a whole picture of actually terms of new forests created and new trees planted with versus trees lost?
Well, there's a lot of parts to that question. The biomass industry in the US, the wood pellet industry, is growing explosively. Many new plants have been built. Each one can, harvest from 500,000 to over 1 million tons of trees per year to make into pellets. And so this is obviously a huge problem. At the same time, we do still see net forest growth in the United States. So there is still, forests are still increasing in the United States. Although that rate of increase is slowed down dramatically, partly because of logging and partly because of things like insect infestations out west and fires and things that are climate change related, by the way. Um, so, we need to turn that line around. We need forest carbon sequestration to really be increasing dramatically. We need the rate. We need to be sequestering more carbon into forests every year if we're going to combat climate change. And instead, right now, we're sequestering less carbon into forests each year, even though there is still net growth accumulating. So it's a little bit of a complicated picture with a lot of moving parts, because we have to think about stocks and flows. So the forest are the stock, and the flow is the new carbon being sequestered by those forests each year. But that rate is slowing, and we actually need it to accelerate to fight climate change.
So it's part of the problem also the fact that biomass is classified as a renewable fuel or renewable energy source, and obviously you mentioned the EU and where a lot of that pressure is coming from, and your organization is having a case against the EU at the moment. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, I just found out that the case was dismissed without a hearing. Just a couple of days ago, we found this out because the court decided that the applicants didn't have standing to sue. So they didn't rule on the merits. They ruled on the standing issue. But the case that we brought challenges the European Union's inclusion of biomass as a renewable energy in the Renewable Energy Directive. And the Renewable Energy Directive is the piece of EU legislation that tells member states what renewable energy they can use to meet their mandated targets, and what renewable energy is allowed to receive these lucrative subsidies. So when they rewrote the RED in 2018, they did the RED recast. They included bioenergy, and they included some so-called sustainability criteria, which they claimed would help reduce the forest and carbon impacts of biomass energy. But in fact, I call them the Potemkin criteria, because they don't provide any protection. They look great on paper, but they don't actually provide any protections. So that was the nature of the lawsuit. And the whole argument is laid out. We have a website for the lawsuit. It's eubiomasscase.org. And unfortunately, as I said, the court has ruled that the applicants don't have standing to sue. But in fact, I was on the phone this morning with the lawyers discussing about whether we're going to be appealing that decision, and it looks like we probably will be.
Okay. Is it just the EU who classify biomass renewable source, or is that happening in other regions and countries as well?
It happens in the United States, Canada, all over the place. Korea, Japan.
So what will need to happen to change that? Is it simply to does it go down to the roots of the UN? Is that a UN kind of approach? Could UN mandate that it shouldn't be classified as renewable anymore, and put pressure on other countries to do that?
Unfortunately, the UN doesn't get to decide. I
No,
think it's up to each member
of
state.
course.
Member states have plenty of discretion. Like some countries, treat garbage burning as renewable energy. We know that's not true, right? And some don't. So it's up to member states. I think what we need to do is educate people about the science. It's not carbon neutral. It is adding a tremendous amount of carbon, more carbon. It emits more carbon out the smokestack than burning coal. And the net effect, the accumulated net effect of those emissions, even taking tree regrowth into account, lasts for decades to even more than a century. So when we switch from a coal plant to burning biomass, we're actually increasing the amount of carbon entering the atmosphere. When policymakers encounter this and take the time to really understand the science, they tend to start reversing their decision. And in fact, we did that here where I live in Massachusetts. The state commissioned a study about the carbon impacts of biomass energy. And when they saw the result, they took subsidies away from large wood burning power plants. They no longer qualify for renewable energy subsidies here where I live. So I have faith that when people do spend enough time with the science and take it on board, that they can change their minds.
Isn't it also a problem how we measure carbon, how we kind of collect that data? Because if you were to say that you have wood pellets that has been created in the US that are shipped by diesel cargo ships to the to the UK, and then the UK public is being told that this is cleaner because you will only actually count the carbon that's emitted in the UK, but actually there's a whole big supply chain. That's actually the forest that's grown in the US, and that's the shipping as well.
Right. Well, the UK, because biomass energy is treated as having zero emissions at the smokestack, the UK doesn't count the smokestack carbon at all. They do count the emissions associated with making the pellets and shipping them over, so which is just a fraction of the total carbon involved. But just the fossil emissions associated with that. But yeah, they don't count any of the forest carbon at all. And of course, that's crazy because they're paying, for instance, that Drax plant gets over 2 million pounds a day in subsidies to burn wood. I think it's like 2.36 million pounds or something. And per day. I mean, imagine what we could do with that money to, insulate houses or put in true, clean, renewable energy like solar panels on people's houses. I mean, you could do a lot with that. And so it's a loophole in the accounting that treats it as zero when it comes out the smokestack, when in fact it's more than coal.
So once people have watched Burn, they're alarmed by it, and by the way, there's also a quite good Channel 4 expose on actually the import of the wood pellets from the US and burned in the UK. Channel 4, a British broadcaster. How can people voice their anger, and how can people get involved?
Oh boy. Well, actually, the European Commission, the European Union right now is having a number of consultations about the European Green Deal. And what that should look like, what the new incentives should look like, how should they regulate forests, what's the biodiversity strategy going to be like. So these are all places that citizens can put in comments. But probably the most effective way to to work on this is to team up with an environmental organization that works on it. And for instance, in the United Kingdom, I recommend that people get in touch with Biofuel Watch. They're a very good organization that does great science-based work on this. And then in the EU, various groups are working on it. I think Fern is probably the one that does the most good work on this. But in terms of finding opportunities to make your voice heard at the policymaker level, it's not easy for individual citizens to make their voices heard. I think people could also potentially reach out to their electricity provider and ask them, is biomass energy part of the electricity that I'm getting? And how are you counting the carbon? Like, why are you incentivizing something that's burning trees for energy? Now, to be fair, not all biomass plants burn trees. Some do burn things like agricultural residues and mill residues and stuff. And those aren't necessarily great either, but at least they're not chopping down trees.
Yeah, I guess like the whole field of biomass is a really great field, isn't it? And it's very complicated in a way, because my next question was, guys, I know we touched this earlier, but is all biomass bad? There's obviously something that's worse than others, but would it be best not to have any biomass going on at all in the energy sector?
I think, we're always going to burn wood. A lot of people burn wood for home heating. In fact, about 60% of the wood burned in the EU is for residential heating. But I think the question is, why are we paying people to burn wood? And that's what the renewable energy subsidies do. And it's not just the direct subsidies for electricity and heat, but also subsidies that are indirect subsidies, like, for instance, state money that gets paid to people to buy a new wood boiler for their home, like to replace a gas boiler with a wood boiler. Now, I'm no fan of gas or oil, but we shouldn't be paying extra to incentivize wood burning. We should be paying people like doubling, tripling, quadrupling wind, solar, geothermal. Um, all biomass burning emits carbon into the atmosphere. And in the most simplistic sense, climate warming at any given time is a function of the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So if you're burning a lot of biomass, even if it's straw, even if it's something that's going to grow back and sequester equivalent carbon the next year, you're still pumping more CO2 into the atmosphere than you otherwise might be, because that straw would otherwise decompose and contribute to soil carbon, and some of that carbon would remain stored. Same thing with forestry residues. So no, I don't think we should be incentivizing any biomass with any subsidies. But do I think that we're going to stop burning wood? No, no, I don't. And I recognize that many people rely on that, that they can't afford other heating fuels.
Absolutely. I wonder, is it also a case about how forests are managed? I know obviously we incentivize people to burn wood, and therefore it increases, but obviously how those forests you work in across the US, how well are they managed? Are they sustainable managed? I guess they're not.
Well, the concept of sustainable management is completely divorced from the concept of carbon neutrality. This idea that somehow, as long as sustainable management means that you're cutting less than you're growing, which obviously is the first condition for having a forest there next year to be able to exploit. So obviously a good business person will always manage sustainably, but that doesn't make it carbon neutral, because forests are taking carbon out of the atmosphere, which is the same as reducing emissions. When you're sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, that's reducing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And even if you're sustainably managing, you're cutting and burning trees, and you're reducing the amount of carbon the net amount of carbon that's being stored in trees, and increasing the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. So that's, speaking to just the carbon argument around so-called sustainable management, those two things are not the same. Now, in terms of like how we manage forests and what we should be thinking about for a forest policy moving forward, plantations are a huge problem. They're biological deserts. They're prone to insect infestations. They're not diverse. They're, often genetically engineered trees that are designed to, grow really quickly and all grow the same and be cut down all at the same time. And, we have some of that. We need some of that for our pulp and paper industry and our building industry. But in general, we need to be rewilding forests. We need to find ways to take some of these plantation forests, here in the United States and, in Europe as well, where a lot of forests are very intensively managed, and rewild them, make them more diverse, reintroduce native species, make habitat, make soil carbon storage, restore the water cycle, stop dumping chemicals and fertilizer, and, let the forests come back. Europe
Absolutely.
is, sorry, I was just going to
No,
say,
no, yeah, go on.
Europe is losing its forest carbon sink as well, like the United States. The rate of carbon accumulation in Europe's forests is slowing down and is less every year than it was the year before. That is a huge problem. If Europe thinks that if policymakers think that they're going to be net zero emissions by 2050, which means that emissions and sequestration need to balance each other, they need to turn that around and increase carbon storage in forests. And the best way to do that is to bring back natural forests.
Yeah, I guess there's also an argument about how you maintain forests and how you grow new species, and actually in terms of actually not introducing invasive species that's not native to those environments, right?
Right. And some plantation species, I don't know if they're necessarily invasive, but they're certainly not native to areas.
Absolutely. I mean, as you allude to as well, there's some species are planted because of the output, not
Right.
not
Yeah.
because of actually creating the forest itself.
And there is a role for that because we need wood products. We're not going to stop using wood products, but to the extent possible, we should renaturalize as many forests as possible and manage them differently. Manage them as if climate change mattered.
So just to finish on this point, are you going forward? Are you optimistic that this can be dealt with? Well, is there a pathway to dealing with this issue? You think so?
There's definitely a pathway. Whether there's the will is another question.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Mary. Thanks for taking time for this.
Thank you.
And we'll share all the relevant links